the day a woman in a beige SUV stepped onto my land, pointed at my tomato plants, and told me I was violating HOA rules. I laughed, until she handed me a fine for a neighborhood I didn't belong to, for land I legally owned, and for a garden my family depended on. That laugh died fast, because what followed wasn't just petty harassment. It was the opening move in a quiet land grab that would test how far entitled people will go when they think no one will fight back. I bought the property 3 years earlier, a modest plot on the edge of a manicured suburban development. The listing was clear: no HOA membership, no dues, no restrictions. That freedom was the selling point. I planted raised beds, installed drip irrigation, and turned bare soil into food: peppers, cucumbers, spinach, rows of tomatoes glowing red by midsummer. It wasn't a hobby. It was self-reliance. The HOA next door hated it. At first it was looks, then whispers, then photos taken from the sidewalk. Finally, Karen showed up with a clipboard, sunglasses perched like armor, confidence sharpened by years of getting her way. She introduced herself as the HOA compliance officer and informed me that visible vegetable gardens were prohibited under community standards. I told her she must be mistaken. I wasn't a member. She smiled like I'd just told a child's lie. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. HOA letterhead, my name, my address, a violation notice demanding removal of the garden within 10 days or escalating. Fines would begin. They cited bylaws I'd never agreed to, rules I'd never signed, authority they didn't have, but they were counting on one thing: fear. I didn't panic. I pulled my deed, my survey, county maps. Every line confirmed it. My land was mine, clean and separate. No easement, no covenant, no obligation. I emailed the HOA politely, attached proof, and asked them to correct their records. They didn't reply. Instead, the next morning, orange survey flags appeared along my fence line, inside my property. That's when I realized this wasn't about vegetables. This was about control, expansion, and a belief that no one would stop them. They had no idea who they'd picked a fight with. 3 days after the flags appeared, the fines began: $50 a day, according to a spreadsheet taped to my mailbox like a threat. No signature, no legal notice, just numbers climbing as if repetition alone could turn fiction into fact. Karen drove by twice that morning, slowing just enough to see if the garden was gone. It wasn't. I was out there watering, calm, deliberate, refusing to be bullied off my own soil. I sent another email, firmer this time, attaching the county parcel map with bold red lines showing exactly where the HOA ended and my property began. I quoted state law about private associations lacking authority over non-members. I even suggested a meeting to clear up the confusion. Their response came fast, and it wasn't confusion. They claimed an implied inclusion, according to them, because my land bordered the development and benefited from nearby infrastructure. I was subject to aesthetic standards. It was nonsense, legally laughable, but dangerous in practice. HOAs survive on pressure, not truth. They don't need to be right if you're scared enough to comply. The next escalation came quietly. A landscaping company showed up while I was at work. Neighbors watched as 2 men unloaded equipment near my fence. Thankfully, my security camera caught it all. The HOA had authorized corrective action to remove the non-compliant garden at my expense. They didn't get far. Once I called the police, the crew left, confused and apologetic. They'd been told the HOA owned the land. That lie mattered. I filed a police report, not because I thought arrests would happen, but because paper trails win wars like this. I also called the county zoning office. The clerk pulled the records and laughed out loud. "They can't touch you," she said, "but you'd be surprised how often they try." Karen wasn't done. She knocked that evening, this time without the clipboard. Her tone was softer, almost reasonable. She suggested compromise. Maybe I could move the garden behind a privacy fence. Maybe grow decorative plants instead. When I refused, she leaned closer and whispered, "We'll make this very expensive for you." That was the moment my patience ran out. I sent a certified cease and desist letter demanding the HOA stop trespassing, stop issuing fraudulent fines, and retract all claims of authority. I included the police report number and informed them that further action would be considered harassment. For 48 hours there was silence. Then the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The agenda, leaked by a friendly neighbor, included one item highlighted in yellow: boundary adjustment proposal. They weren't backing down. They were preparing to redraw lines that weren't theirs to move. And if they succeeded, my garden would be the least of what I lost. The emergency meeting took place in the clubhouse I wasn't allowed to use, behind doors I wasn't invited to walk through, discussing land they didn't own. A neighbor slipped me the audio recording. Listening to it felt surreal. Board members spoke about my property as if it were an error that needed correcting, not a deed recorded at the county. One of them even said, "If we act confident enough, he'll fold." That sentence decided everything. The so-called boundary adjustment wasn't legal. They knew it, but they also knew most homeowners never challenge an HOA once. Lawyers and paperwork start flying. They planned to file an amended plat quietly, hoping no one would notice until it was too late. My vegetable garden was just the excuse. What they really wanted was precedent. The next morning, stakes appeared where the flags had been. Driven deeper, clearer, deliberate. Spray paint marked a new proposed line, slicing straight through my raised beds. Tomatoes crushed under boots. Soil kicked aside like it meant nothing. I stood there staring, heart pounding, realizing this had crossed from harassment into attempted theft. I didn't call the HOA. I called a land use attorney. Within an hour, he confirmed what I already knew. What they were doing was illegal, but dangerously effective if unchallenged. He recommended immediate action, an injunction, formal notice to the county, and a surveyor on site to lock the facts in place. I hired him on the spot. That afternoon, a licensed survey crew arrived, bright vests and tripods drawing attention. Karen watched from across the street, arms crossed, jaw tight. When the surveyor hammered iron pins exactly where my deed said they belonged, every one of them contradicted the HOA's imaginary line. The surveyor filed his report the same day. The attorney moved faster. Cease and desist letters went out to every board member individually, warning of personal liability for trespass, property damage, and fraud. The county received formal notice disputing any attempted amendment. The police report was updated. Photos of damaged crops were logged. What had been intimidation was now documented misconduct. That night, my doorbell rang again. Karen stood there, no sunglasses this time, eyes darting past me toward the garden. She tried a new approach, concern. She said the board felt misunderstood, that maybe we could settle this without lawyers. I told her the time for that had passed the moment they put boots on my soil. She warned me I was making enemies. I smiled and told her the truth. Enemies need power. All they had was noise. And noise fades fast when it meets facts, law, and someone willing to push back harder than expected. The garden stayed. The stakes didn't. And the HOA was about to learn how expensive confidence can be when it's built on lies. The injunction hearing happened sooner than anyone expected. My attorney framed it as an emergency, citing ongoing trespass and irreversible damage to food-producing land. The judge agreed. Notices went out, and suddenly the HOA that had been so confident behind closed doors was scrambling in public view. Board members who had never expected to see a courtroom now had to explain themselves under oath. Karen sat in the front row, arms folded, confidence replaced by calculation. The HOA's lawyer argued that the association acted in good faith, believing my property fell under their jurisdiction. The judge asked a simple question. Where was the signed agreement? Where was the covenant? Where was my name on any document giving them authority? There was no answer. Silence filled the room, heavy and undeniable. My attorney presented the deed, the county maps, the professional survey, the photos of trampled crops, and the audio recording from the emergency meeting. When the line, "If we act confident enough, he'll fold," played in court, Karen's face went pale. Good faith doesn't sound like strategy. It sounds like honesty. The injunction was granted immediately. The HOA was ordered to cease all contact with me, remove all markers from my land, and pay for the damages to the garden. More importantly, the judge issued a warning. Any further interference would expose individual board members to personal liability. That warning landed hard, but the real blow came a week later. The county reviewed the HOA's attempted plat amendment and rejected it outright, flagging it for potential fraud. That triggered an audit, past boundary changes, enforcement actions, fines. Neighbors started talking. Questions spread. Suddenly, I wasn't the problem. I was the proof. Karen resigned from the board 2 days after the audit notice went public. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, emails leaked showing panic, concern about legal exposure, insurance coverage, and whether directors and officers' insurance would even apply if misconduct was proven. The HOA's confidence collapsed into damage control. The landscaping company sent an invoice, not to me, but to the HOA for the failed removal attempt. The police closed my report as resolved in favor of the property owner, and my attorney sent one final letter, a demand for reimbursement of legal fees, backed by statute. The garden recovered faster than expected. New plants went in. Soil was turned. What they tried to erase grew back stronger, visible proof that intimidation doesn't last. But the story wasn't finished, because once the HOA realized they couldn't bully me, they tried something else. Something quieter, meaner, and far more desperate. And that final mistake would cost them more than they imagined. When the HOA stopped sending letters, people assumed the conflict was over. It wasn't. Silence was their last tactic. They hoped time would dull attention, that I'd drop the reimbursement demand, that neighbors would forget the audit. Instead, the opposite happened. Homeowners started asking questions about fines they'd paid, about boundary warnings they'd never challenged, about whether the board had ever actually been right. My attorney filed a civil claim for damages, legal fees, and harassment. The evidence was airtight. Facing mounting pressure, the HOA's insurer launched its own investigation. That was the final crack. Insurance companies don't tolerate ambiguity when fraud is even hinted at. Coverage was suspended pending review, leaving the board exposed personally. The board called a special meeting, this time open. I attended, sitting quietly in the back. Homeowners filled the room, murmurs buzzing like static. When the treasurer admitted the association had no insurance coverage until the investigation concluded, panic set in. Dues wouldn't cover a single lawsuit, let alone multiple. One by one, residents stood up and spoke. Someone mentioned fines for flower colors. Another described threats over a fence line. A retired couple asked why their backyard had been reclassified without consent 5 years earlier. The pattern was obvious now. My garden hadn't started this. It had revealed it. A vote was called to suspend enforcement actions, then another to remove remaining board members. Karen wasn't there to see it. By the end of the night, the HOA existed in name only, stripped of authority and function. Months later, it would formally dissolve, its assets sold to cover legal obligations. My case settled quietly. The HOA paid damages, legal fees, and signed a binding agreement acknowledging it had no authority over my land, ever. The county recorded the settlement alongside my deed, permanent and public. No future board could pretend otherwise. The garden thrived. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped to talk. Some asked for advice on growing food. Others apologized for staying silent earlier. I didn't hold grudges. Fear makes people quiet. Courage makes them free. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A vegetable garden, something meant to sustain life, ended an organization, built on control. I still work the soil most mornings, hands dirty, mind clear. Every harvest reminds me of the lesson they never learned. You don't need permission to stand on what you own. And when someone tells you otherwise, the right response isn't anger, it's resolve.